Hello and welcome to Nerdicky. For nerds, by nerds, I'm Nerdicus Dave, and today I'm hanging out with Tim Woods, professional dungeon master. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dave. Great to talk to you. How are you doing?
Good, good. So like we had this we met through kind of like odd circumstances, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I'll go into that a little bit. But first I want to have you introduce yourself and kind of tell people a little bit about what you do.
Absolutely. So I am, obviously a huge fan of Dungeons and Dragons going back for a long time, and I became a professional game master partially due to my background in teaching. I started to observe, like in the world of teaching, there was a lot of overlap between game mastering and teaching, and I ended up writing my PhD on that and really studying this kind of interesting overlap. But that kind of led me inevitably into this career that I have now, which I'm very lucky to have, kind of teaching after school programs of kids, Dungeons and Dragons, working with companies, with groups of friends, and just all kinds of different, adult and younger groups, spreading the word of D&D, as it were, and teaching it kind of in all these different unique contexts.
Yeah, I mean, I really saw that kind of like crossover really boom several years ago on a program called Outschool.
Mm-hmm.
We have a friend that of the channel who was kind of like struggling, and then just started doing like D&D for kids over there, and really like turned the whole trajectory of their family around through Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely. I think it's incredible that this can happen. I think the impact that it has on individuals, on the hobby, both people who are getting served by professional game masters and the difference it makes in the professional game master's life. I think it's just the mental shift, even in many ways, is like such a profound one when you're doing something that you love and making it your career. I think that teachers have been really the ones picking up the baton, and I think through my like research, incidentally, I'm like not surprised by that, because I do believe it's such an interesting overlap. And I have a cousin who is running an after school program where her number of students has like doubled this year. I think a lot of teachers are migrating from other curriculums to being like, no, I'm going to teach D&D. And that is, that was the evolution for me, was less and less I was teaching other classes, and just more and more the class that I became the expert on was teaching Dungeons and Dragons, and figuring out where in the world of education, both private and non-private education, would that kind of need be fulfilled. And I think it's so cool to see how it's spreading. I think it's becoming a more and more common thing for sure.
So real fast, folks, as always, there are links in the description so you can go check Tim out, perhaps acquire his services for yourself. And I feel obligated to mention the fact that we just launched a Kickstarter today, and that is now live. There's a link to that in the description as well. And then after we're done here today, you can head over to Nord Games YouTube channel, and Nerdicus Ted will be over there talking about the project. Uh, so how long have you been working as a professional GM now?
I've been a professional game master for, let's see, at this point, it has been around 12 or 13 years. I've been doing it professionally. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for a lot longer than that. But in terms of like working with schools, getting paid to run events and stuff like that, it's probably been over 13 years now at this point.
Oh, so you went through some dark times of it as well, I imagine. It's always been I feel like it's getting better, but in the past it's been a pretty hot button topic. And very divisive in the community.
Definitely. I would say the first 3 to 5 years of me trying to advertise and put my services out there, I just came to accept that
Yeah.
every time I advertised, I was going to get, for every interested party or interested potential customer or client, I was going to get eight people. Who are you? And who do you think you are? And how dare you? And my personal favorite is, I would never charge. Like, I can't even imagine being in your headspace, because I'm such a pure celestial descent. So it's like
I
there's
know.
a lot. I feel like I got to see all of it, and I got to experience like what the debate was. And there was a debate. There was a very interesting discourse to be had, but I also saw that there was like most of the criticism wasn't actually engaging with what the debate was. It was really just dismissing the idea out of hand. And once I saw that the percentage of criticism was mostly just an outright dismissal without actually considering what this service really was, that's when I was like, oh, everyone's dumping on this idea, but no one's actually thinking about what does it mean. And so once I saw all the criticism was kind of like a lot of hot air, I was actually more interested in what I was kind of pursuing here. Like, I think I'm on to something. I think this is actually a lot of potential to make the hobby something new and exciting on a fundamental level, kind of.
Yeah, I'm honestly very surprised you've been doing it so long, and it's good for you. Like, um, and I feel like usually the arguments are very dishonest anyway, because it's like when you get to the root of it, it's like, well, they would pay to play with Vin Diesel, or they would play with be in Chris Perkins' game,
Definitely.
or Matt Colville's, or Matt Mercer's game. Right? So like,
Absolutely.
there's a level where they see the value in paying a dungeon master, but but at the same time they have this argument, like this purist argument against it. So I always found it dishonest. And I want to say, like, almost like half of those people are like that, right? So, and I'm always like, so I'll just be honest about my feelings about professional GMs and that doing that as a job. I think it's a terrible business model. Like, I think it's a lot of work, for not a lot of money oftentimes. And
Dave, I gotta say that's not the worst criticism I've heard. I think that's actually fairly, like, as far as the criticisms go, like, you're onto something there. It is a very tough model to monetize, is what I would say. It is not an easy one to pursue as a monetization model.
There's a lot of professions where you're limited by the time, right? You can only run so many games.
Absolutely.
And also, I think it's a very demanding job.
Yes.
And early on, there was a popular YouTuber already in the space when we came into it, and a lot of their model was just running games for fans, for a price. And I looked at that and said, "Oh my God, I would hate gaming if I did that, right?" Because they were just running it so much.
Right.
And that's just me personally. Like, that is not a put down on anyone who wants to do that, anyone that makes money that way. Listen, I feel that an honest day's work is an honest day's work, and I don't care how you do it, right? If you're happy and the people you're working with are happy, then go for it. But as far as businesses go, like, I used to be a personal trainer, and it was the same problem. I could only see so many people at a time. I would have days where I would see like 16 people in one day, and by the end of the day, I just wanted to put a shotgun in my mouth.
I think personal trainer is actually a great analog for like what the issues are that come up in my work. It's a ton of like burnout in terms of I would say the pandemic was a great example of where I was like, oh, I don't have to commute anymore. I can run even more games. And I'm like, I've fallen into this trap in my career before of like, oh, I could always just run more games. It's like, really? You can't. There is a definite limit on how much D&D I could run and still be running at the quality that I wanted to be running at. And I discovered that during the pandemic, in fact, yes, I had to commute less, but I also had to cut back more for my own mental health. I've discovered that is one of the larger bottlenecks when it comes to how many D&D games I can run, and time and energy. All of these things are the reason why, I think it is a very rewarding career in so many ways, but I don't think most people who love game mastering would want to do it professionally. I think it is a very small sliver of people who love game mastering a lot who would want to see a way to pursue this as a career. And for my part, I'm happy to say I'm like teaching classes on how to professionally game master, how to game master at like, a more advanced level, how to game master if you're a beginner. Teaching classes and doing publishing work and game design have become a space that I've moved into more and more, and not for no reason, because I'm looking to the future and thinking like, well, it'll be nice when I only have to run 4 to 5 games a week as opposed to between 6 and 10. And, I can focus on other projects instead that aren't nearly as demanding as weekly D&D games, or even bi-weekly or monthly D&D games.
From a business standpoint, any business, kind of, you need to be able to do two things with it. You need to be able to have leverage, and
Yes.
you need to have be able to have an exit strategy.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
YouTube, like has a little bit of that problem, right? Like me and Ted are the personalities of Nerdarchy, so it would be hard for us to extract ourselves from that. But the other thing is that works really well with YouTube is like you can leverage time because we can shoot a bunch of videos, put it up there, and they'll live on YouTube forever, and they'll basically work for us all the time. But any job where it requires you to personally be there doing the thing, like that, that's always going to be limiting by your time. And there's like tons of professions that are like that: hairdressing, teaching martial arts. I have a buddy that would teach martial arts mainly one on one, and he ended up shifting to doing like online courses for that reason.
Absolutely. I think online courses are one of those like opportunities that I think, the past 2 years, a lot of people have been like noticing and kind of definitely I am among that number of people who wasn't thinking about online classes until the pandemic. And then suddenly it was like, ooh, there's a lot more opportunity for me to get information and play ideas into the hands of more people this way and to really rethink what I'm, exactly doing here. But you're right, it's time is the biggest factor in how much time you can spend with people.
So Brian Smith always wants to nag. Has a question. What's the worst DM advice you've heard?
Oh, the worst DM advice I've ever heard. Oh man, there's so much bad DM advice though. It's hard to pick a favorite. I
Uh,
mean, the worst DM advice. I mean, it would be something along the lines of like always follow the rules, or like I think it would be fun to put forth something that sounds good on the surface, and then it's like no, when you actually try to implement it, it doesn't work. It's like play D&D, not the game your friends want to play. It's like no, that's like that encapsulates a lot of bad advice into
yeah.
one. It's like it's important to honor the rules, not what people at the table want. It's like yeah, I'll go with that. That'll be my bad advice.
Yeah.
Don't listen. Don't listen. That's the worst DM advice. Don't listen.
Yeah. Close off your see that. See,
Mhm.
I feel like the opposite. The best thing you can do when working with your players in your group is listen twice as much as you talk.
Mhm,
There's
mhm.
a they'll keep feeding you gold all day long
Absolutely,
if you let them.
100%. I'll say that I think having run games for so many different groups, so many different people with so many different play styles, I've just found that D&D is a different game everywhere you go. It's only dialect. There is no central language. And so every time I show up at a group, I'm finding out what game they think they're going to play and trying to deliver that game to them. And that's a very weird thing. I say my job is all the insight check. That's what it boils down to. I got to get into that room and without asking a million, like, how many years have you been playing D&D? And what are your thoughts on second edition? I can't do a whole like
Yeah.
100 questions like that. I need to be able to read the room immediately and just be like, these people want to follow the rules very strictly, or these people don't give an F about the rules. They just want to have fun and be an elf wizard. And like, I have to find out where they kind of fall on that spectrum. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's just meeting them wherever they happen to be.
What is the longest you've ever worked with a group or individual?
I have professional. I mean, the longest I've worked with a group on a non-professional.
Professionally.
Yeah, that would be my family in that case. But
Yeah.
because but I grew up playing D&D with them. But professionally, I had a campaign that went on for a little over 5 years, and we just wrapped it up at the beginning of 2021. And it was a kind of situation where it was kind of like, will we do another campaign? No. Well, then this is it's like it was a wonderful 5 years, and we got to bring our story to completion. But then they kind of like started game mastering for themselves, which is most of my groups. I would say I run one campaign with them, and then they kind of bud off and become their own group. So I think of myself as like Johnny Appleseeds, just like starting D&D groups where I go, and then they grow kind of on their own. But that group went on for a little over 5 years. We did Storm King's Thunder, and I added all this like extra content and stuff to really flesh it out from levels but 13, we got all the way to level 20. And then because I don't know how to pace high level games quite yet, we spent a year playing through a dungeon at level 20 as 20th level characters, which was interesting as an experience.
Oh, I bet.
Not one I would want to do again necessarily or put people through, but it was really funny because we spent all of the year 2020 at 20th level. So it all felt like it was kind of
the year of 20.
It was the year of 20s, exactly. So
do you find it difficult after you're working with people for a long time, professionally, because at some point you get to know them and you kind of become friends with them? Like, I know, like, I hate it when we have like these higher levels on our Patreon and someone I personally know will jump in and support us, and then like I'm supposed to like give them coaching and stuff. And not that it's a problem or that I mind, but it just feels really weird because I'm like, I already know them and I already kind of like think of them as a friend.
Absolutely. I think that was one of the earliest problems that I feel like I ran into in terms of stumbling blocks. Was I discovered very quickly there's no way to play D&D with people and not either start to like them more or start to like them less, maybe, but focusing on them more. I think it's like I just started to realize, like, this idea that I would try to not be friends with my players, it's a losing battle from the start. You're not going to win that fight. And so I was just like, yeah, my players are friends of mine. The biggest issue I discovered was like, I can't just rely on those friendships. I need to have non-professionally based friendships like outside of my groups. And I was spending so much time with my groups, it kind of was getting muddled for me, less for them. But I early on did have to, figure out, how was I going to negotiate that? And what I discovered was I'm not in a unique position in that, right? I'm sure as, a personal trainer, as so many different careers, therapy comes to mind. Like, there is this strange bleeding of I'm getting to know someone better. I am starting to like them more. I'm becoming friendly with them. Now I become friends with them. And I am very lucky that all the clientele that I have worked with have a good sense of professionality, where it's always like, we're friends now, Tim, and they acknowledge that. But it's not like, well, we're friends now, when do I get free games, or when do I feel very lucky that I haven't really had that come up as a sticking point or issue with all of the friends that I have made through my career, kind of.
And also what I find is it's a me issue, right? It's not a them issue. Usually, like they're happy to keep paying me. Like, a lot of times that's why they did in the beginning, because they wanted to support, what we're doing, especially for us, where it's like we knew people already and then they come in afterwards. It's easier, I guess it's easier with people that I work with, and I didn't know them before. But
I think it's a huge part of being a professional, is recognizing that the people who are paying you are not doing this because their hand is tied behind their back. They're doing it because they want to, because they're seeing a value in what you're providing. And it's not that I've never had a player who is like, kind of like, what am I, what am I getting what I want out of this? I engage that, but at this point, I'm almost like, if there's even an inkling of that, then probably there is a mismatch. Honestly, I do not want to have any, and I'm very happy to say at this point, I don't have any clients who it's like, I might feel like, oh, I didn't do my best work at that game, but I don't have any clients who are like, man, I'm really feeling like Tim is not providing what I want. People are, if there's any inkling of that, then it gets worked out very quickly at this point, or it's a group that kind of like fades off to the wayside and things work out very organically in that sense. So I think it's a tough thing to deal with when you are worried about, am I providing this person who is my friend with what they want? But there's a recognition that people don't spend their money frivolously in most circumstances, and are if they're supporting you, it's because they see the value in what you're providing.
So Phil has a question for you. How would you run a small campaign within a single location, such as Castlevania being located within a castle, tons of backtracking, without it feeling too railroaded?
Ooh, so I run dungeon crawl one shots. So I think that's kind of what this person is asking a little bit. Like I love adventures that focus on like one central location. And I'll say, just because he mentioned Castlevania, Castle Ravenloft would be an example of a tough location. I think that's like, if I had to think of one location that is tough to run, that is a well-known example in D&D, Castle Ravenloft is a classic castle that has a lot of moving parts. I would need to like do a lot of prep to run Castle Ravenloft. And so if I'm running a location-based adventure, especially if it's just like a 3-hour one shot and I don't want it to feel railroady, it's almost like I have one answer to that, and it's a very concrete one. There's a dungeon, they come in through the front door, then past whatever encounter is in the front door room, there's another room with 3 doors. And then it's like there's kind of 1 or 2 things behind each of the 3 doors, but you have a choice. Now, is it that complex a choice? Is it not true that it only matters what order you're going to do these 3 rooms in? And that ultimately, I fully expect you're going to do all 3 rooms, but I'm going to keep it interesting. Behind one door is the Lich. Behind the other door is the Lich's study with his phylactery and stuff in it. And then the other one, that's where all the cool treasure and monsters are. So it's like, yeah, the order you approach these in does matter, and it's going to really actually impact how things go in the other 2 rooms, whichever one you go and clear. But and there's also like a little bit of like, I'm trying to see if I can split the party. Can I trick you guys into going into 2 different doors at the same time? But ultimately, if it's a short adventure that I'm trying to do one location in, just multiple doors, that's really it. I don't try to make it too complicated, much more complicated than that. Choice of doors is a video. We see how video games do that when I'm describing all the time, and like that's your decision that you make, is which path are you going to follow. If it's a story, then that's narratively done. If it's a location, then you're doing it in much more concrete terms, no pun intended.
Yeah, and I think if you want to run like a longer game like that, it's doable, but you need to lock them in. And
Yeah.
when I
Mhm.
when I when I say that, not necessarily physically lock the characters in, but you have to like emotionally or mentally lock them in and make them want to be there and not to leave.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that can be trickier. Like you have to figure out what is going to invest the players' characters in that location, that place, and then you just need like interesting things to do other than fight stuff, right? You have to give them
Absolutely.
puzzles to solve and things to interact with and explore and learn about. And,
Mhm.
otherwise, they're not going to want to stay there. They'll get bored and want to wander off.
Absolutely. If it was a location that I'm trying to keep them there over multiple sessions, I can appreciate that's very different and in many ways tougher, because I've had groups come back to the dungeon that we're in the 4th week of journeying through, and they're like, well, what are we even doing here anymore? Like, I've watched that
Yeah.
happen in real time, and I kind of can intuitively ballpark when it's going to happen. So if I am going to run a dungeon that I know they're going to spend 5 weeks in, first of all, there's going to be 5 different sections to that dungeon that each feel like they have a different flavor to them. There's going to be I think what's the name of the adventure? The Forge of Fury, I think of as a great example of an adventure that takes one dungeon, divides it into 4 floors, and each floor feels very distinctive. One is the Dwarven Mines, one is the Orcish layer, one is like, I don't know, there isn't a lava room, but I would put a lava floor in to really help them feel like we're in a different section of this dungeon for this week. I would try to make the different sections each week feel a little bit different. And I would start off each week being like, listen, I don't expect anyone to remember anything because we've been fighting our way through a dungeon and we may have lost sight of the goal. I think that's totally fair and totally understandable. We are here because we were told, remember, because we were told by these people that this thing kind of awaited us here. And like, give a little refresher, give a little reminder, because those dungeon crawls, I think, are inclined to make people forget the goals a little bit on some level, for better or worse, because you get bogged down in the minutia of what's happening within the dungeon and you forget what is the larger campaign about during those longer dungeon crawls.
And how many sessions a week are you running?
On an average week, I mean, I have cut back in more recent years, especially during pandemic and stuff. I have cut back to more like 6 to 7, maybe 8 a week. I've definitely in the past run more games per week. There was a year where I was running an average of 9 to 10 games just regularly every week, and that I feel like is like I think back to that, and I'm like I was a younger man back then. Ultimately, the
Sounds
answer to
grueling.
as it was grueling, and I think I was like post academia kind of seeing is like, well, this is less grueling kind of. But now I'm kind of like taking a step back. I have other projects I've taken on, writing and game design, where I don't have time to run as many games, so it's more like 6 per week generally, I would say, nowadays.
So I had mentioned earlier that we had kind of met like through like seven degrees of separation almost.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because you were I guess you were in charge of a corporate event.
Yes, I was asked by, I would believe that was the Atlassian game. The company had reached, maybe it wasn't, no. Either way, the
That
company had
sounds
reached,
familiar.
yeah, yeah. The company had reached out to me, and it was one of those fun things where I knew that they didn't know what they were getting into. So I was trying to walk step in step with them through the whole
Yeah.
process of like, okay, this is what it's going to look like. This is what you're going to need. And in the series of questions, somehow, normally I'm very careful about this, somehow I slipped and did not go over how many people are in a D&D game. And when they got back to me and said, we have 30 something interested people, I responded like, what you are talking about now, like I have run 10-player games. I have run 12 and
Yeah.
13-player games. I know what those look like. And it's, I'll say for the D&D fans out there, not D&D, but it is something that is possible for me to run that will create an enjoyable experience and a fun narrative that everyone can kind of follow and have their little moment to participate in this narrative. 13-player game is not possible in terms of D&D, but is possible in terms of creating something. And I told them like the number we have is not sustainable. We are going to need, and they asked me who else do you know that you can bring in? And I'm like, not enough people. Like I will reach out to everybody I know, but I don't, if everybody says yes that I
Yeah.
am reaching out to, we still won't have enough people. So, and I was fully expecting they were going to shut down the event. Instead, they reached out to like all these amazing game masters and it was in my head. I remember being like, well, I could have just gone to like my favorite YouTubers and stuff. Like if I knew that's what you were going to do, I would have helped you with that. But
Yeah.
I was very impressed that they went through the due diligence of reaching out to like some of the best people out on the market for my money that I
Well,
got to then meet.
actually, that's I don't even think that's how we ended up there because Jake Cosman had interned for us,
Mhm.
and I don't even if you know him or if he kind of was contacted through someone else. Like I said, 7 degrees of
I,
separation.
I think
And
it was the company that reached out to him at that point. Yeah.
yeah, so I don't even know how they found him, and they asked us about it, and it was like there wasn't many details, and they're like, "Well, how many people can you have?" And it was like a short like event too, like an hour and a half. I'm like,
Absolutely. That's another thing was they were giving me an hour and a half to work with. So already that's like the worst bottleneck possible.
and
Yeah.
and like on top of that, like it wasn't really explained very well about what it was. So I was like, an hour and a half, or you can only do like 4 or 5 people to a table, because I broke it down. I'm like, well, this is how many minutes there are. This is how much time each person would get if you break it down, and that's why you can't. That's why you can't really go past that and give a good experience because they were also paying really well for an hour and a half. Like normally, I won't even do paid DMing gigs, right? But the number was high enough where I was like, "Oh, I'll do that." I mean,
Absolutely. I am, especially with the companies that reach out to me, I'm inclined to kind of take what they're proposing and be like, okay, how can I make this work for them? Very often they're talking about like 2 hours. I'm lucky if I can get 2 hours with them.
yeah,
Very often they're like, what can we do with 45 minutes? And I'm like, something, I'll tell you that, but like I'll
Yeah.
be very realistic about what your expectation should be and stuff, and usually I can talk them up to, but that particular group, they had a hard exit at an hour and a half, so I'm like, well, then what we need is a lot more game masters, not just a few more game masters at that point.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, that was one of the ones where I was like, this is what I can do, and here's what I think you should do to, like, if you want this event to happen. But in my
Yeah.
head, I was like, I can't help these people. Like, I had done my best at that point, and I was very impressed that they kind of picked up the slack, as it were, and delivered on
Yeah,
something
and
that.
then like I got into the event, and it was like, oh, and by the way, like none of these people have probably played D&D before, and like as like people were getting into the room, it was like, oh, by the way, I might have to leave because I'm actually working right now and do work.
That to me was actually, that's where I get relieved when I hear that nobody here has played D&D. Also, we're not really even fully paying attention because we're apparently on the clock right now. That's
Yeah,
where I'm like, all right, what these people are, the bar is not like at a convention like Gen Con or something,
yeah,
where
yeah,
somebody sits down like, I have a character ready and I'm expecting a certain quality of game. It's like somewhat of a relief when you get into a corporate event like that, and it's like most of the people here, if they get to go home and say, I was an elf and it was weird, like that is its own fun story
yeah,
for
yeah.
most of those people. And it's like, that's where the bar is for a good number of my clients, like in events like that and outside of events like that. It's kind of just like they want to be a wizard for a day, and like very often I say I'm game mastering for that person. I am not game mastering for the person who's like, well, I decide to play a blade singer because normally I play this kind of wizard, so I'm excited to try something different. I'm like, you know what, if I can enroll the person who's like, what's an elf, then
Yeah.
I already know Mr. Blade Singer over here is going to be having a great time. I don't need to reel him in. Who I need to reel in is that person, and if I can reel that person in, then all the hardcore players at the table, they'll fall in line and they'll have a blast. I don't need to worry about them. I need to make sure that there isn't, a few people at this table who are just like, I don't know, what should I do? Because that will kind of erode the fun for everybody, and it makes people feel like, their hobby is not, being welcomed. Like I'm kind of aiming at the most casual player at the table, because I watch that dynamic kind of encourage everyone. When everyone's having fun, even if they don't know the rules yet, suddenly we're in a good dynamic to play and to learn the rules going forward.
Yeah, I will say, like, honestly, like, if you could do a corporate event like that once, once a day for 5 days, you would make a very good living. Like,
Absolutely.
I had to work, like, I've made more than that, but I also had to work a lot of overtime doing a grueling job, to do it.
Well, and that's where I say the thing that I don't think it's the thing that helps people understand what is my career, but I think it's what the fans of D&D are not as excited to hear, is that very little of the work I do involves the hardcore people who love D&D and eat and live and breathe D&D. Very often they're taken care of. They are game masters or they have game masters. 90% of the people that I'm working with on a daily basis are coming from outside the hobby, and those are the gigs that really pay me the big bucks. So in terms of making this a monetized practice, I learned very quickly my demographic was never going to be D&D players. My demographic was always going to be people who wanted to play D&D, who felt underserved by the current state of the hobby. And given that you are one of the great examples of people bringing people into the hobby, there are so many amazing people out there trying to help make this hobby easier for people to get into, providing on-ramps for people who are like, I love D&D, I want to learn more about it. Well, this YouTube series is going to help me to feel like I'm part of this community. And yet, and we have these, I used to run Wednesday D&D encounters at stores. Like there's a million different ways to get into D&D, and yet I tell people, here's all the people who play D&D, and here's the demographic of people who would play D&D if they felt they have access to it. And yet they don't. For some reason, they feel like they don't have access to it, and those are the people who very often are reaching out to professional game masters and stuff. So I think this is a hobby that so many people would play, and being that access point is a potential career opportunity, I found.
So Brian's got another question for you. How would you suggest an over prepper loosen up their brain to actually run the games and whittle down their prep? And I mean, maybe you're an over prepper. I don't know.
This is a question after my own heart, because I'm an over prepper. I especially earlier on in my campaigns, I tell people now I try to do less than 1 hour of prep per hour of game, because I've whittled it down to that much. I can do that ratio. I can do 2 hours of prep for a 3-hour game. I can do 1.5 hours of prep and still have a very solid 3-hour game. But it used to be I would do 6 hours of prep for a 3-hour game. If you let me, I would do 10 or 12 hours of prep, no problem, to get ready for a 3-hour game. And the truth is, there's no limit to how much prep you can do. In a game like D&D, what am I going to do? Consider every possibility? Guess what? That number in D&D is infinite. It's not like, well, there's only 4 players and they have this many powers. No, they could make up something that is not covered by their powers and very quickly go off the rails, no matter how big a network of rails you have created for them. And I have found that there were diminishing returns in a big way. Once I went past hour 3 of prep for a 3-hour game, I didn't see a lot of my prep being used in the game. And that's the rub, because I think over preparation isn't a bad thing inherently. It's a bad thing because you might be feeling like your time is wasted. But any prep you do is valuable in some sense or another, except in one way. When you over prepare and you prepare for like these 8 possible things and they do thing 9 instead of one of those 8 things, I find that when I over prepare, I was less resilient and willing to improv. It was a me problem, because I'm like, well, I just spent 12. All of a sudden I feel those 12 hours of prep and how pointless they were. And all of a sudden I don't want to improv. It's not that I can't. It's that all of a sudden I'm like, why do I have to fucking improv after I just did all that prep? They are, and I see the delight on their faces where it's like, oh, like, and that's what D&D should be. D&D should be, I did an hour of prep, but you know what? When you come up with a fun idea that is just like a way to get around the town guard instead of deal with them, I should be like, you know what? That's amazing, guys. You did it. Because players love. That's a huge thing when you're a professional game master and it's like, oh, guys, I didn't expect you to do that. I make sure to tell people that now. I make a point to really tell it, like, hey, everyone, drum roll, please. You got me. And like there's like, people love that because there's a fun satisfaction, and it's not as much fun when I do 12 hours of prep and I'm like, man, I'm feeling like what I could have done with those 12 hours instead of prepping. And now I'm improving for them, but I also feel like that bitterness is coming through and I don't want it to be there. So
you could have prepped all your games instead of that one.
I could have prepped all my other games. I could have spent time with my family. Like I could have done any number of things. And so when that's the only downside to over preparing that I have found that really is enough of an incentive for me to be like, no, I'm going to stop over preparing, because it is, I'm going to believe in myself and in my relationship with the players that I will do this amount of preparation and we can improv the rest. And I find it enables me to improv better when I am going in kind of being like, you know what, maybe they'll do something weird. And I find that especially for higher level games, more and more often I do prepare like You know what? Here's the challenge. And I think they have enough magic that they're going to find creative ways around this that I haven't thought of. So that like whatever, I'm done here. I'm prepared to be surprised by, and the higher level the game is, the more tricks they're going to have up their sleeve, the more surprises they're going to inherently have. And I've just come to like accept that as a byproduct of high level play. Is me almost like prepping a little, not less, because high level play comes with increasing prep as well, but it's almost like I just have to accept there's going to be bigger swings, not just in terms of the numbers, but in terms of like a good example of this is I have a 16th level game where they were fighting a lich. It was supposed to be even just like a mini boss. I'm like, this is how high level we are, everybody. The lich is the mini boss on the way to the real boss. Yeah. And I was going to have him teleport away to Orcus, his main boss. And like, it would be him and Orcus hanging out for the final battle. And he plane shifts away. And that's where the rogue who had the cubic gate goes, he went to another plane. Do we know that, Tim? Okay, cool. I used my cubic gate to drag him back. And I'm like, can your cubic gate do that? Can you just bring a person from another plane? And we found out, yeah, you can apparently. Yeah. But he watched in real time me go from being like, and I guess we know where we'll be fighting this lich in round 2. Sorry, everybody. I even warned you after his last turn. It looks like he was preparing a plane shift spell. This is this villain pulling his get out of jail card to like, we'll see you next time. And then they beat not the lich, but like literally me. And there was a certain amount of satisfaction to that when it's like you beat the game master's plan. And I'm like, yeah, that's what happens at 16th level. My plans will more routinely just get beaten. And I don't need to feel bad about that because they're level 16 at this point.
You know, you can make plans, just don't plan the outcome.
Absolutely. And like I had seen, okay, 2 possible outcomes. He's either going to die or he's going to escape. And I had not planned for that final outcome of him getting like yo-yoed back to the group. And like, that's exactly it. You can't plan the outcomes. You can only plan some ideas.
Quick reminder, folks, you can find the links to Tim in the description, as well as we just launched the Kickstarter. So you can check that out as well. And later today, actually immediately after this live chat, Nerdocus Ted will be over at Nord Games on their YouTube channel, so you can go hang out with him and hear him talk about the Mage Forge. Yeah, so like I think the only areas you can kind of work on ad nauseum and your work's not really wasted is when you're talking about world building and sandboxy things. And the caveat to that also is that you enjoy doing it. Yes. Because you could prep that stuff all day long forever, right, and never be done, which is fine as long as you're enjoying it. If you're gonna play many games in those areas, like it's always stuff that you can pull out and just like names and taverns and shop owners and maybe a couple encounters, loot drops, all things that like if you have to improvise, they'll make your life easier because you can just go to a list and pull something off of it.
Absolutely. It's actually funny because I think all of what has led me to this career is the fact that every level of D&D prep, from world building on top all the way down to like learning the monster stats, making individual maps, I love every step of prep. I love dungeon mastering, but it's almost like it like gets my social anxiety up a little bit. So I think like in some ways prepping is like all the perks of game mastering without like being on stage in that moment. So I love that every aspect of the creativity of it. And it's so funny that world building, I think it's very common, is the most fun creative stuff, definitely, when you get to do those like overarching ideas. And I discovered like in many ways that's the part I need to turn off the most, because it's the part that will get the most out of my control if I let it. If I don't pull it in on a leash, suddenly I'll be like, oh man, and like the way the wizard society should work is like this, and I'll start making up all this lore. It may get used, it may not. The point is probably I should be prepping monster stats or something like that, something that's going to be used in that session. And I am working right now with a group that we're interested in putting together a YouTube series. So one of the things was they wanted to do a custom world. And I'm like, all right, everyone, I will make a custom world, but once we do, like, that's it. It's done. Like, I will do this once, and then like we will and then I need to like create that world and then be done like creating it. And like once I kind of opened up the dam, it all came flooding out, all these ideas, and I'm like, all right, that's good. I have enough to make a campaign, and now start to lower the dam back into place. And it's like hard to so there are different levels of creativity, and I think the world building, it's so easy to get lost in it. It's actually where I have to be the most cautious, because I'm like, oh cool, I can make up this. Wait, hold on before I start making up how this, like, what is. And I notice it even in the games. When I run games with kids, very often kids will be like, wait, Tim, you just mentioned frost giants, but we know how stone giants work. Do frost giants have the same sort of society, or is their society different? And then I'll just be like, okay, I can answer your question, but I can't answer that question that won't result in a 10-minute conversation minimum, everyone. And they're like, and the kids will like all look at each other and be like, no, we're in, let's do it. And I'm like, okay, Frost Giant Society is ruled by a series of Jarls, okay? And then like, it inevitably, like, it's not just like I tell them about Frost Giant Society, it's like they start coming up with their own societies, like, oh, so they would think more like there's a hierarchy like this. And I'd be like, yes, exactly. And with kids, it's hard to not do that, because in many ways, when you say D&D is a learning process, I firmly believe at any age we are learning by playing Dungeons and Dragons. And so when I watch them like sussing out how a society might work, engaging with the debates of like, well, dark elves are ruled by an evil priesthood, does that make them all evil? And like watching kids actually have that discussion and not turn to me for the answer, but rather have it amongst themselves. I'm like, this is really what the game is about. This isn't necessarily just about the dice rolls and me telling you what happens. It's about us telling the story together, and that's kind of what they're doing right then and there. So it's really cool to see it happen.
That is a lot of fun, and it's always great when you can turn those questions back on them, the players, and they're like, well, if drows are ruled by an evil priesthood, are they all evil? That's a good question. What do you think? You know?
Absolutely. And I'll almost be like, especially with kids groups where I know, or a group where I know I have like permission to kind of play with these ideas as the game master, you can gotta be like, well, what you were told was this, and like kind of throw that out there as like a ball to be played with. Like, well, are you just going to take what you were taught at face value, or are you going to examine it and maybe wonder why your parents, the high elves, told you this about dark elves and like stuff like that? I think there's really, and the fact that they're then playing in that world. I watched a whole discussion about all the weird stuff happening in the Underdark with Dwagar, with dark elves, and like we kind of went into all of it. And then in the middle of a campaign that was like Horde of the Dragon Queen. So it's like, well, we weren't really planning on going into the Underdark. So I even admitted like a lot of this is just kind of happening in the background. And then one of the characters, who is a dark elf, just goes like, well, when we're done fighting the dragons, I'm going to go into the Underdark and start cleaning up this mess of societies that are going on down there. And I'm like, whoa, all right. I know what your side quest is going to be. This is going to be amazing. Like, I'm looking forward to it. But also, you just described a big mission, as it were, that would not be easy in theory to accomplish. And he's like, I know what I said. I'm here to restructure some societies. I'm like, love it. That's awesome.
we call that in the biz job security.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. I'm like, I'm going to make this as challenging as everything in the rule books have told me it should be.
So Phil's got a question for you. How do you deal with players who want to loot every piece off a corpse, literally and figuratively speaking?
Man, I mean, that's an example of something where I look at the group, and is the group having fun with this? I don't have, as a dungeon master, a stance on like what is too little looting, what is too much looting. That seems to me like something that would always be on the group side of like, what are they looking for? My instinct is to say, I'm going to let anybody loot anything, and I'm going to give my Timm Woods's actual feedback to how I'm feeling about this. If you start yanking teeth, I'm not going to be like, okay, I'm just going to be like, gross. Okay, that's going to be my response. I'm going to say
Yeah.
yes, but I'm also going to be like, okay. And I'll even be like, especially if it's like younger players or something, I'll be like, why? Just so I know, what are you hoping to accomplish here? Just wondering, no judgments, but just wondering, because if they, there might be a reason that they're collecting teeth, and I'll be like, that's not how teeth work, or something like that.
Yeah.
But if they're doing it to get a reaction very often, and this is almost like a teaching technique more than is a game master's technique, if they're doing it to get a reaction out of me, I just won't necessarily give the reaction. I'll be like, gross, but okay. I won't stop you. I can't stop you. So you're just going to keep doing this gross thing, I guess. And like, I won't give the satisfaction of being like, no, you can't. That's too many teeth. Like, gross. Like,
Yeah.
I'll just be like, okay. And very often, as soon as I have that reaction, it's the balls pass back to the group. And then the question is anybody else in the group grossed out? And then that's their issue to work out. And then it's like, this guy keeps, I'm like, that's fair. You're grossed out by it, and you can tell that they're grossed out by this. So do you respond to the fact that they're grossed out? And they start to have a discussion amongst themselves, especially with younger groups. The more I can make that a discussion they have versus a discussion they're having with me, the better that's going to go, I think, because then it's kind of like, I want the other players to be like, why are you looting that? And they'll be like, I can sell it in town. And it's like, true, but we don't want to sell. We don't want to be the guys who come into town selling goblin eyeballs, do we? And it's like, so I love to watch that kind of a discussion maybe take place amongst the group, as all the great discussions do, from why are you looting that to like, why did you run ahead and what did you learn? I've literally had like 11-year-old players have that discussion with each other. Did we learn something from you running ahead and getting hit by no fewer than 10 kobold sling rocks all simultaneously? Like, did you learn, or am I gonna have to withhold my healing magic until you do learn? Like, the organic learning is some of the best learning that can take place.
I agree. Like, throwing it back to the players, see how they interact with each other, or even, like, what are the circumstances when they're doing this? What's going on? Are they doing that in the center of town? Right? It wasn't one of the guards that people in town actually knew. Are they inadvertently causing a mob to form? Are people whispering and pointing?
Absolutely. And it's like you say, pay attention to what's going on around you. It's paying attention to what's going on in the game world. It's also paying attention to what's going on outside the game world, and being it's like a big, especially if somebody's like doing it in the middle of town, then I'll be like, I love to be like, pause the game for a second. What do you think's gonna happen here? And let them tell me, well, what are the, people in town in medieval times are always pulling teeth out of it. And it's like, no. We're talking about two very different medieval worlds then. I always go back to, I ran a Call of Cthulhu game where somebody was like, oh, I just make acid because I know all I have to do to make acid is pour these things together. And I'm just like, I don't think we're talking about, no, first of all, I don't believe it's that easy. Number two, I see a possibility for error here, so roll for it. He's still just like, I think it's easy. I'm like, I don't. And and then I was like looking around at the group, like kind of like trying to gauge the reaction. Everyone's like, no, he's making acid. He should have to roll for it. And I'm like, I'm sorry. We're voting for what this reality is essentially here. And acid's not easy to make. And by the same token, looting people in the middle, looting a town guard in the middle of town. Like, I wouldn't just be like, and then the town guard shows up. What did you think was going to happen? Like, I'll actually pause the game, because if we're not on the same page as people, we gotta be, if we're going to move forward from here, like at this point. And that I do, because it's a good way to prevent like metagame arguments. I never want to have an argument about like, what would have happened here, and did I realistically, before we get to that argument, I want to iron out with the player ahead of time, what does he think is realistic, what do I think is realistic, and maybe can I be enrolled into his point of view? Like, actually, I hadn't thought of that. I guess people wouldn't be paying attention to this necessarily, or something like that. But I've run kids games where people were like, I pick up the body, and due to rigor mortis, it holds up the portcullis. And I'm like, oh, I see the confusion. That's not how rigor mortis works at all, really, kind of. So now that we know that, what would you actually, do you want to like lift up the gate, or what are you trying to do here? Because we were just confused how bodies work.
I know we call them stiffs, but that's not really how it works.
We call them stiffs, but he's been down for 3 seconds, my man. So like, I'm sorry to tell you, he's not holding a door open for you.
And it's a dead person, not a 2x4.
Exactly. So and like I literally like listened to a student being like, the body holds it open for me, and he just kept repeating it, and I'm just like, what are we talking about? I'm so confused. Are you a necromancer and I don't know it? There was like 10 different miscommunications before I finally understood what the real miscommunication was, and we were able to move forward from there. So there's a lot to be said for metagame conversations when it comes to like bad behavior. It's like often that's miscommunication and getting to the root of what people's expectations are and stuff. Like having
that's great. That's such a kid thing to try and do too.
Absolutely. And it's like, I literally, after the 5th time of like being like, I don't understand what you think you're doing here. I thought the kid was trying to troll me or something. It was just like, I've decided this body works for me or something. Like, I thought I was really being like egged on until I realized it was a miscommunication. And that was a big learning moment for me to kind of be like, I need to ask more questions before I start feeling myself getting angry and stuff at players.
Yeah. I'm like
they're just not listening.
That's funny. Take inspiration, but also that doesn't work like that.
Exactly. Like, yeah, exactly. I would want to give inspiration for like, you were really bearing with me as I got to where you were. But now, and like, that's where the teacher emerges, and I got to be like, and we all learned something about rigor mortis today, didn't we? Like, it's powerful force. It's not that powerful.
How long did you spend teaching?
I was, before I was a professional game master, I had studied, I had gone abroad teaching English as a second language. And I had done that for 2 years in 2 separate countries. And the second time I did it, that was the first time they were asking us, like, if you could put together an after-school program. We don't care what it is as long as it involves English. So I was like, okay, it's going to be D&D then. And when I ran that, while I was teaching in Chile, I discovered that compared to the actual classes where I taught English, the D&D classes were like extremely effective in terms of them learning English language, because basically I was sitting at the front of the room like, I don't speak any Spanish, so if you want to, and they were immediately understanding the rules. I found that students, regardless of language barriers, D&D, especially in recent years, is something that translates so well to students, like concepts like avatars, concept like having certain moves that have pros and cons. These things translated immediately to the kids, and I watched a student. I understood what he was trying to communicate to me was, I want to hit these 3 goblins with my ice blast power because I'll get all 3 of them. And he couldn't communicate that to me in English. So he was turning to his friend like, how do I tell him that I want to do the ice blast? And I'm just like sitting there like, this is good. This is
they're teaching each other.
They're teaching each other. And peer-to-peer learning is like some of the best learning possible. So like I was watching, it was like accelerated learning happening at the table. And so I think that teaching background really informed everything that I got interested in when it came to game mastering. And then I was teaching while I was finishing my degree at the college level, watching how bringing role-playing game techniques into even the freshman college writing classroom had like very interesting results in terms of engaging students who would have maybe not been engaged by ordinary writing projects. I think it was really cool to see how much D&D could serve as a teaching tool, and how teaching instincts of like being patient, asking questions, encouraging critical thinking, but not telling people what to think, those things helped me become a much better game master in terms of like not just telling people, well, this is the right move. It's like, yeah, when I teach, I could do that also, but like you literally don't learn from that. So how can I get them to think about their options and then also choose what they deem to be the best option?
That's great. So we are coming up on the hour mark. Final thoughts before we head on out?
I mean, I'll definitely say, I obviously I could talk about this forever. I am, teaching classes on how to be a better game master, how to be a professional game master. So I would definitely encourage people to check out my website for if they enjoyed, the advice that I had, how to get more of it, perhaps. And obviously great gaming to everybody, and I hope everybody's games are going well these past couple of years. It's obviously a different world, but I think a world that is getting more and more excited about D&D as time goes on.
And as always, folks, links are in the description, including that link to our new Kickstarter that just dropped today. And also, I just dropped a link in the chat to go over to Nord Games YouTube channel and hang out with Nord Games people, as well as Nerdarchist Ted, to talk about the Kickstarter that's going on right now and whatever other nerdy thing comes up. Thanks for coming on, Tim. It's been great hanging out with you. And until next
Absolutely.
time, everyone, stay nerdy. And we're